when the U-96 finally returned from the deep. The ghost of Das Boot refused to die. The cold steel of U-96 creaked under the immense pressure of the North Atlantic as depth charges exploded overhead, shaking loose dust from every surface inside the submarine. Men, faces contorted in silent terror, clung to pipes and equipment as their world became a cacophony of destruction. This was not merely a boat. It was a metal coffin sliding into the abyss with 48 souls aboard, each one grappling with the stark realization that the sea shows no mercy to those who challenge her depths. And yet, against all odds, this particular U-boat would forge a legend that transcended its wartime service, a ghost that refused to sink into historical oblivion. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The Type 7IC submarine U-96 slid into the waters at Germania Werft shipyard in Kiel on April 1, 1940, as the Third Reich's naval ambitions expanded across European waters. The submarine's operational life began under the command of Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, a 29-year-old naval officer whose leadership would become the inspiration for the character of Der Alte, the old man, in both Lothar Günther Buchheim's novel and Wolfgang Petersen's epic film, Das Boot. Willenbrock, with his calm demeanor and tactical brilliance, would guide U-96 through some of the most dangerous waters of the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. Unlike many of her sister ships, whose stories ended in violent destruction, U-96 would survive the war physically intact, only to be reincarnated decades later through the lens of one of the most acclaimed war films ever created. The U-boat war represented Germany's best chance to bring Britain to her knees through a strategy of economic strangulation. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, believed that by sinking 750,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, Germany could starve Britain into submission before American industrial might could turn the tide. U-96, as one of the Type 7C submarines that formed the backbone of this campaign, became an instrument of this grand strategic vision. The Type 7C was a remarkable engineering achievement, representing the perfect balance between offensive capability and underwater maneuverability. At 220 feet long and displacing 871 tons when submerged, U-96 could reach speeds of 17.7 knots on the surface and 7.6 knots submerged. Armed with 14 torpedoes and a deck gun, she was designed to strike quickly and then disappear beneath the waves before escorts could respond. The harsh reality of submarine warfare in the North Atlantic defied glamorization. Inside the pressure hull of U-96, 48 men lived in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The boat's interior, barely 7 feet in diameter at its widest point, was a claustrophobic labyrinth of pipes, valves, and machinery. Privacy was non-existent. Men slept in shifts on bunks still warm from the previous occupant. The air grew increasingly foul during long dives, thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Condensation dripped constantly from metal surfaces, creating what submariners called submarine weather. Food came from tins that gradually dented and rusted as the patrol progressed. Fresh water was rationed so strictly that men sometimes went weeks without proper washing. And yet, despite these conditions, U-96 embarked on 9 war patrols between 1940 and 1943, becoming one of the most successful submarines in the German Kriegsmarine. Life aboard U-96 followed a rhythm dictated by the demands of combat and survival. The day was divided into 4-hour watches, with each sailor responsible for maintaining and operating the complex machinery that kept the boat functioning. The forward torpedo room housed not only the primary weapons but also served as sleeping quarters for 17 men. Torpedomen slept literally inches away from the weapons they serviced. The control room, heart of the submarine, contained the dive planes, periscope, hydrophones, and navigation equipment. From here, Willenbrock would make the split-second decisions that meant the difference between success and destruction. Behind the control room lay the radio and sonar compartment, where operators maintained a constant vigil for enemy transmissions and the telltale sounds of approaching vessels. The diesel room housed the twin MAN M6V4 46 engines that powered the boat on the surface, while further aft, the electric motors used for underwater propulsion occupied their own compartment. At the very rear of the boat, the stern torpedo room combined additional sleeping quarters with the second set of torpedo tubes. In this confined space, sailors lived a parallel existence to the world above, developing their own customs, superstitions, and gallows humor to cope with the constant stress. U-96's first patrol in December 1940 provided a sobering introduction to the realities of submarine warfare. Departing from Kiel on December 4th, the boat headed for the North Atlantic shipping lanes west of Ireland. For 10 days, Willenbrock searched in vain for targets, battling severe winter storms that made periscope observation nearly impossible. On December 14th, lookouts finally spotted a solitary merchant man, the British steamer Apapa, 9,133 tons. Maneuvering into attack position, U-96 fired 2 torpedoes. The first missed, but the second struck amidships, sending the vessel down in less than 20 minutes. According to the boat's war diary, 3 survivors were spotted in the water, but deteriorating weather conditions prevented any rescue attempt. This first kill established the pattern that would define U-96's operational career: patient hunting followed by precise, lethal strikes. The early years of the war represented the happy time for German U-boats, a period when Allied anti-submarine warfare remained relatively undeveloped. During her second patrol in March 1941, U-96 demonstrated the deadly effectiveness of Wolfpack tactics. Operating as part of the Sea Wolf Group, Willenbrock positioned his boat off the coast of Greenland, where convoys carrying vital supplies from North America to Britain were forced to navigate through a narrow corridor. On March 16th, lookouts spotted the silhouette of convoy HX-112 on the horizon. Moving into attack position under cover of darkness, U-96 launched a series of torpedoes that struck 3 merchant vessels. According to the boat's war diary, Kriegstagebuch, Willenbrock noted with clinical precision 3 hits confirmed, ships breaking apart and sinking rapidly. Proceeding to new attack position. By morning, the convoy had scattered, and U-96 claimed 5 merchant vessels, totaling 33,000 tons, a devastating blow to Allied shipping. The technical aspects of submarine warfare during this period reveal both the strengths and limitations of U-96's capabilities. Torpedo technology, despite being the primary weapon, was notoriously unreliable. German torpedoes suffered from depth-keeping problems and premature detonation issues that weren't fully resolved until late 1942. Willenbrock compensated for these deficiencies through meticulous attack planning and multiple torpedo salvos. Surface attacks at night were preferred, as they allowed the boat to use its superior surface speed to maneuver into optimal firing position. U-96 typically approached from the darkened side of the convoy, using the silhouettes of merchant ships against the moon or stars as aiming points. Once torpedoes were launched, the submarine would immediately change course to avoid the predictable counterattack from escort vessels. Radio discipline was paramount. Willenbrock would maintain radio silence, except for the brief encoded messages to BDU, Befehlshaber der U-Boote, the U-Boat High Command, confirming successful attacks or requesting new patrol instructions. The third patrol of U-96, from April to May 1941, demonstrated the increasing coordination of German submarine operations. Assigned to Wolfpack West, U-96 joined 8 other submarines in a coordinated assault on convoy OB-318. On May 8, 1941, Willenbrock's boat struck first, sinking the British tanker Ensis, 607 tons, and the cargo ship Empire Caribou, 4,161 tons. The Wolfpack attack continued for 3 days, resulting in the loss of 7 Allied ships. This success came at a cost, however, as improved convoy escort tactics claimed 2 U-boats during the engagement. U-96 narrowly escaped detection when a British corvette passed directly overhead, while the submarine lay motionless at a depth of 150 meters. The crew maintained absolute silence for 4 hours, not even operating the bilge pumps despite rising water levels in the boat. This episode highlighted another reality of submarine warfare: the psychological stress of silent waiting, listening to the ping of enemy sonar growing first louder and then, mercifully, fainter as the danger passed. Life in the Atlantic changed dramatically for U-96 and her sister boats with America's entry into the war in December 1941. Dönitz immediately launched Operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat, sending submarines to the previously undefended American eastern seaboard. U-96's 6th Patrol took her across the Atlantic to these hunting grounds in January 1942. Operating off the coast of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, Willenbrock found rich targets sailing with minimal protection and often fully illuminated despite wartime conditions. Between January 20th and January 30th, U-96 sank 5 ships totaling 36,000 tons, operating sometimes within sight of the North American coastline. American naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison would later call this period America's second Pearl Harbor, as U-boats wreaked havoc on shipping while the U.S. Navy struggled to implement effective countermeasures. The success of this patrol earned Willenbrock the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of Nazi Germany's highest military decorations. But war at sea is never one-sided, and the Allies were learning quickly. By late 1941, improved radar, sonar, and air cover began to turn the tide against the U-boats. During her 5th patrol in November 1941, U-96 experienced this shift firsthand. While stalking convoy OS-10, the submarine was spotted by a Sunderland flying boat. The following 8 hours became a nightmare as escort vessels pummeled the area with depth charges. Inside U-96, the crew endured a hellish ordeal that would later be immortalized on screen. Instruments were smashed, light bulbs shattered, and men suffered concussions from being thrown against bulkheads. The psychological torture of waiting for the hull to crack was perhaps worse than the physical damage. One crew member later recalled, "Each explosion felt like a sledgehammer to the chest. We could hear the metal groaning around us. Everyone knew that the next charge could be the one that sends us to the bottom." The boat survived by descending to nearly 280 meters, well beyond its designed test depth of 200 meters. The pressure was so intense that gauges failed and seals began to leak. When U-96 finally surfaced that night, the crew found themselves in the midst of a raging Atlantic storm, adding nature's fury to their ordeal. It was during this patrol that war correspondent Lothar Günther Buchheim joined the crew, documenting their experiences with both camera and notepad. His photographs captured the gaunt, exhausted faces of men pushed to their limits, images that would later inform his novel and the film it inspired. Buchheim's presence aboard U-96 during these harrowing moments would ultimately ensure that this particular submarine would never truly be forgotten, unlike hundreds of others that disappeared into the depths with all hands. Buchheim's observations reveal the complex social structure that developed aboard U-96. The boat's crew was divided into distinct groups based on specialization and rank. The officers, Commander, First Watch Officer, IWO, Second Watch Officer, IWO, and Chief Engineer, formed the leadership corps. Beneath them were the petty officers who supervised specific technical functions: the torpedo chief, Oberbootsman, the chief quartermaster, Oberstartermann, and the diesel chief, Obermaschinenmat, among others. The enlisted men made up the majority of the crew, further subdivided into seamen, mechanics, electricians, radiomen, and torpedomen. Despite these formal divisions, the confined space and shared danger created a unique atmosphere that blurred traditional military hierarchies. Willenbrock, like many successful U-boat commanders, maintained discipline while fostering a more egalitarian environment than would have been permitted aboard surface vessels. He ate the same food as his crew, endured the same hardships, and remained accessible for consultation. This leadership style would be captured faithfully in Peterson's film, where Der Alte stands as a counterpoint to Nazi fanaticism, concerned more with his men's survival than with ideological considerations. The reality of daily life aboard U-96 during long patrols was far from the dramatic action depicted in combat reports. Boredom was as much an enemy as Allied depth charges. Men combated the monotony through a variety of pastimes. Card games were particularly popular, with some marathon sessions lasting days. Reading material was passed around until books literally fell apart from overuse. Music came from a small phonograph in the officer's wardroom, with classical recordings providing a surreal counterpoint to the mechanical noises of the boat. Many submariners kept journals or wrote lengthy letters to loved ones, though these could only be mailed once the boat returned to port. Food became an obsession as supplies dwindled during longer patrols. The boat's cook worked miracles with canned goods, but by the final weeks, meals became increasingly unappetizing. Coffee was brewed until it reached the consistency of tar, and cigarettes, a precious commodity, were smoked down to the smallest possible stub. Personal hygiene deteriorated as fresh water supplies were prioritized for the engines rather than washing. Beards grew unchecked, and the smell of unwashed bodies became so pervasive that returning crews often required several days to readjust to normal sensory conditions. By 1942, the tide of the U-boat war was turning decisively. The introduction of convoy escorts equipped with improved detection equipment, coupled with long-range aircraft armed with depth charges, created a lethal environment for submarines. The Allies had also broken the German naval encryption codes, allowing them to route convoys away from known U-boat concentrations. During her 7th patrol in March 1942, U-96 encountered this new reality when attacking convoy ONS 67. After torpedoing a Norwegian freighter, the submarine was immediately counterattacked by 3 corvettes. For 17 hours, U-96 evaded destruction through a combination of skilled maneuvering and sheer luck. When she finally limped back to her base in La Pallice, France, the boat's hull was dented and scarred from near misses, and several crew members required medical attention for injuries sustained during the prolonged depth charge attack. The French port of La Pallice, near La Rochelle, served as U-96's operational base from June 1941 onwards. As part of the 7th U-boat flotilla, the submarine operated from this Atlantic harbor, protected by massive concrete bunkers designed to withstand Allied bombing. These U-boat pens, some with roofs up to 18 feet thick, represented the permanence of German naval ambitions on the Atlantic coast. For the crew of U-96, La Pallice offered brief respites from the tension of patrol. Men would flood into the local establishments, spending their accumulated pay on wine, women, and momentary pleasures. Relationships developed between some crew members and local French women, creating complicated personal dynamics in the occupied territory. The local French population maintained an uneasy coexistence with the German sailors, recognizing that many submariners were professional military men rather than ideological Nazis. This complex relationship between occupiers and occupied would later be hinted at in Peterson's film, where French dock workers and prostitutes interact with the crew of U-96 during their brief shore leave. The 8th patrol of U-96, from October to December 1942, revealed how dramatically the strategic situation had changed. Sailing as part of Wolfpack Wotan, the boat spent 3 weeks searching for convoys without success. When a convoy was finally located, improved escort tactics prevented U-96 from achieving an attack position. For the first time, Willenbrock returned to base without having sunk a single vessel. This patrol also witnessed a near mutiny when the second watch officer, an ardent Nazi, attempted to enforce political indoctrination sessions during off-duty hours. Willenbrock intervened, making it clear that operational efficiency, not ideology, was his priority. This incident illustrated the tensions that sometimes existed between professional naval officers and the increasingly desperate Nazi leadership, which demanded fanatical commitment as Germany's military situation deteriorated. The operational history of U-96 continued until March 1943, when Admiral Karl Dönitz, recognizing the changing fortunes of the U-boat fleet, reassigned the vessel to training duties in the Baltic Sea. By this point, U-boats operating in the Atlantic were suffering catastrophic losses. What German submariners called the Black May of 1943 saw 41 U-boats destroyed in a single month. Willenbrock, having completed 8 successful patrols, was promoted to command a flotilla, and U-96 received a new commander for its final operations. The submarine that had once been at the forefront of Germany's Atlantic campaign was now teaching new submariners skills that, statistically, few would survive to use in combat. The mortality rate for U-boat crews had become so high that service in the submarine fleet was essentially a death sentence. 75% of all German submariners would not survive the war. The technical adaptations made to U-96 during its operational life reflected the evolution of submarine warfare. Initially equipped with a standard configuration, the boat received several upgrades during shipyard overhauls. In August 1941, a second periscope was added to provide redundancy for this critical component. By early 1942, improved hydrophones enhanced the boat's underwater detection capabilities, while the addition of a METOX radar warning receiver in mid-1942 gave some protection against air attack. The most significant modification came in late 1942, when U-96 was fitted with additional anti-aircraft guns, recognition that Allied air power had become the U-boat's most dangerous enemy. A 2-cm flak gun was mounted on the Winter Garden, behind the conning tower, and a 3.7-cm gun was installed on the main deck. These modifications increased the boat's surface displacement by several tons and slightly reduced its diving speed, but the enhanced air defense capability was deemed worth the trade-off. Life at the 2nd U-boat training flotilla in the Baltic, where U-96 spent its final years, presented a stark contrast to frontline service. Based at Pillau, now Baltiysk, Russia, the boat conducted simulated attacks and evasion maneuvers in the relatively safe waters east of the Danish Straits. Young officer candidates and enlisted trainees cycled through the submarine on 2-week rotations, gaining hands-on experience from veteran crew members who had survived the Atlantic campaign. The training regimen was rigorous. 14-hour days of repeated diving drills, torpedo loading exercises, and damage control scenarios. Despite being removed from combat, there remained an element of danger. Training accidents claimed several U-boats during this period, including U-51, which sank with all hands during a diving exercise in May 1943. U-96, however, maintained an exemplary safety record throughout its training career, a testament to the professionalism of its permanent crew. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, U-96 was still afloat in Wilhelmshaven. Unlike many U-boats that were scuttled by their crews in Operation Regenbogen, Rainbow, U-96 was surrendered intact to Allied forces. The submarine that had survived depth charges, aircraft attacks, and the relentless North Atlantic was ultimately destroyed, not in combat, but as part of Operation Deadlight, the Allied program to dispose of captured German U-boats. On February 15, 1946, U-96 was towed into the North Sea and sunk by naval gunfire, an ignominious end for a vessel that had once been the pride of the Kriegsmarine's submarine fleet. As she slipped beneath the waves for the final time, it seemed that the story of U-96 had come to a definitive conclusion, But in reality, her most significant chapter was yet to be written. In the years following the war, Lothar Gunther Buchheim struggled to process his experiences aboard U-96. The horrors he had witnessed, the camaraderie he had observed, and the complex moral dimensions of serving in Hitler's Navy haunted him. It wasn't until 1973, nearly 3 decades after the war, that he published Das Boot, The Boat, a novel that drew heavily from his time aboard U-96. The book became an immediate sensation, notable for its unflinching portrayal of submarine warfare and its refusal to either glorify or condemn the men who fought in these conditions. Buchheim wrote, "They weren't Nazis, they were sailors. They weren't fighting for Hitler, they were fighting to survive." This nuanced perspective, controversial as it was, captured the attention of German filmmaker Wolfgang Petersen. Buchheim's novel deserves closer examination as it forms the crucial link between the historical U-96 and its cinematic resurrection. The 600-page book combines meticulous technical detail with psychological insight, creating what many critics consider the definitive literary account of submarine warfare. The narrative follows a war correspondent, clearly based on Buchheim himself, who joins a submarine identified only as UA for a single patrol. Through his eyes, readers experience the monotony, fear, and occasional moments of terrible beauty that characterized life aboard a U-boat. The book's power lies in its unsentimental presentation of men at war, neither heroes nor villains, but professionals doing their duty under impossible conditions. Buchheim's prose captures the sensory realities of the submarine environment with remarkable precision. The smell of diesel and sweat, the constant background noise of machinery, the texture of condensation on metal surfaces, the taste of increasingly rancid food. These details, drawn directly from his experiences aboard U-96, create a visceral reading experience that transcends typical war literature. The novel's success brought renewed attention to the historical U-96 and its commander, Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, who had maintained a low profile after the war, found himself the subject of intense interest from historians and journalists. Though he never sought publicity, he occasionally granted interviews in which he confirmed the essential accuracy of Buchheim's account while disputing certain characterizations. Willenbrock noted that the novel's portrayal of tension between the submarine's commander and Nazi Party officials was based on real incidents, though somewhat dramatized. He particularly objected to Buchheim's implication that he had been reckless with his men's lives, pointing to his record of completing 8 patrols without losing the boat as evidence of his caution. Nevertheless, Willenbrock acknowledged that Das Boot captured the essence of the U-boat experience better than any other account he had encountered. When Petersen began production of the film adaptation in 1979, he faced the immediate challenge of recreating a Type Suevde U-boat. With no surviving examples accessible, the only intact Type C U-995 was a museum ship in Laboy and unavailable for filming. The production team constructed a full-scale replica of U-96. Built at Bavaria Film Studios near Munich, this replica was an engineering marvel in its own right. Every detail, from the control room to the captain's tiny cabin, was meticulously recreated based on original blueprints and Buchheim's photographs. For interior shots, the replica was mounted on hydraulic systems that could simulate the motion of a submarine in heavy seas. The verisimilitude was so complete that several actual U-boat veterans who visited the set reportedly suffered panic attacks, so powerfully did the replica evoke their wartime experiences. The film's production was nearly as grueling as the actual U-boat patrols it depicted. To capture the claustrophobia and psychological pressure of submarine service, Petersen kept his actors confined in the replica for extended periods. Jürgen Prochnow, who portrayed the captain based on Willenbrock, later described the experience as psychological torture. The cast was not allowed to go outside or see sunlight for weeks during filming, which resulted in the pallid, strained appearances that lend the film such authenticity. Cinematographer Jost Vacano developed a special handheld camera system to navigate the cramped interior of the replica, creating the fluid, documentary-like footage that gives viewers the sensation of being trapped inside the vessel alongside the crew. The sound design of Das Boot established new standards for cinematic realism. Sound designer Mike Lemaire spent months recording authentic submarine noises, from the ping of sonar to the creak of hull plates under pressure. These recordings were then layered into a complex soundscape that immerses viewers in the submarine environment. Particularly effective is the sound of depth charges, a distant thump followed by a terrifying crescendo as the explosion nears the boat, then the cacophony of breaking glass, rattling equipment, and men's screams as the shock wave hits. This audio experience, combined with the visual claustrophobia of the submarine interior, creates an almost unbearable tension during combat sequences. The film's music, composed by Klaus Doldinger, complements these effects with a haunting main theme that alternates between martial confidence and existential dread, mirroring the psychological journey of the crew as their situation becomes increasingly desperate. When Das Boot premiered in 1981, its impact was seismic. The 149-minute theatrical version was later expanded into a 293-minute television miniseries, and eventually a 209-minute director's cut. Each version reinforced the film's reputation as not merely a war movie, but a profound anti-war statement. Critics and audiences were stunned by its technical brilliance and emotional power. Roger Ebert called it one of the most authentic war movies ever made. The film received 6 Academy Award nominations, an unprecedented achievement for a German production at that time. More importantly, it permanently altered public perception of the U-boat war, humanizing the German submariners who had previously been portrayed as one-dimensional villains in Allied war films. Through the film, U-96 achieved a kind of immortality that had eluded the actual submarine. Millions of viewers worldwide experienced the terror of depth charge attacks, the tedium of patrol, and the camaraderie of the wardroom through the replica of U-96. The opening sequence, showing the boat departing from La Pallas while Willenbrock stands on the bridge scanning the horizon, became one of cinema's most iconic images. The musical score by Klaus Doldinger, with its haunting main theme, evoked both the majesty of the ocean and the doom lurking beneath its surface. In a strange twist of historical memory, the cinematic U-96 became more real in popular consciousness than the actual vessel that had prowled the Atlantic decades earlier. The film's portrayal of submarine warfare changed how audiences understood this aspect of World War II. Previously, U-boats had appeared in Allied war films primarily as faceless enemies, dark shapes in the water that heroic destroyers and aircraft sought to destroy. Das Boot reversed this perspective, showing the U-boat men as individuals caught in the machinery of war. The film does not shy away from acknowledging the deadly purpose of their mission. U-96 is hunting merchant ships carrying supplies that Britain needs to survive, but it also refuses to reduce the submariners to simplistic villains. Instead, it presents them as professionals doing their duty while struggling with the moral implications of their actions. In one pivotal scene, after torpedoing a British tanker, the crew of U-96 watches in horror as survivors burn to death in flaming oil on the water's surface. Their commander, despite his earlier triumph, orders them below decks, unable to bear witnessing the consequences of their victory. This moral complexity, absent from most war films of the era, gave Das Boot a depth that transcended typical combat narratives. The replica of U-96, built for the film, found a second life as one of Germany's most popular tourist attractions. Installed at the Bavaria Filmstadt film city near Munich, it allowed visitors to walk through the control room, peer through the periscope, and sit in the captain's chair, experiencing firsthand the claustrophobic conditions that submariners endured. For decades after the film's release, This replica served as a tangible link to both the historical U-96 and its cinematic incarnation. Veterans of the Kriegsmarine's submarine service, including some who had served on the actual U-96, occasionally visited the replica, providing tours and sharing their experiences with younger generations. The replica thus became a unique space where cinema, history, and memory converged. Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, the actual commander of U-96 during its most successful period, survived the war and went on to have a distinguished career in the Merchant Marine. Unlike many former U-boat commanders who struggled to adjust to civilian life, Willenbrock thrived in the post-war years. He became captain of the cargo ship Weissenberg and later worked for North German Lloyd Shipping Company. When Das Boot was released, Willenbrock was initially skeptical, but eventually acknowledged that the film captured much of his experience commanding U-96. In one of history's curious footnotes, Willenbrock and Jürgen Prochnow, the actor who portrayed him, met several times before the captain's death in 1982. Prochnow later recalled that Willenbrock told him, "You played me better than I could have played myself." Other crew members of the historical U-96 experienced varied fates after the war. The first watch officer, whose name is recorded in naval archives as Friedrich Grade, returned to his pre-war profession as an engineer, working on hydroelectric projects in Bavaria until his retirement in 1975. The chief engineer, Lenz, emigrated to Argentina in 1948, joining several other former German submariners who sought new lives in South America. The radio operator, Werner Lott, became a successful businessman in Hamburg, occasionally giving lectures about his wartime experiences. Not all stories ended happily. The torpedo officer, Wilhelm Spar, committed suicide in 1951, leaving a note that referenced his inability to forget the faces of drowning men. These individual fates reflect the broader challenge faced by German veterans after 1945, how to reconcile their wartime service with life in a defeated nation struggling to process its Nazi past. The technical legacy of U-96 and other Type 7C submarines extended far beyond their operational lives. The Type 121 Electroboot, developed in the war's final years, incorporated lessons learned from the Type 7C's strengths and limitations. Though too late to influence the outcome of World War II, the Type 121's revolutionary design, featuring a streamlined hull, snorkel system, and greatly increased battery capacity, influenced post-war submarine development worldwide. The Soviet Whiskey-class and American Tang-class submarines of the 1950s both reflected design elements pioneered by German engineers based on U-boat combat experience. Even modern conventional submarines owe a debt to the evolutionary process that the Type 7C represented, the balance between offensive capability, defensive systems, underwater endurance, and crew habitability that submarine designers still wrestle with today. The cultural impact of Das Boot extended beyond cinema into literature, music, and even video games. The film's success prompted renewed interest in naval history, leading to the publication of numerous scholarly and popular works about submarine warfare. Musicians across various genres found inspiration in the film's themes and atmosphere. The British heavy metal band Iron Maiden released The Trooper in 1983 with lyrics that echo the fatalistic courage portrayed in Das Boot. Video game developers created submarine simulation games that attempt to recreate the technical and psychological challenges faced by U-boat crews, with titles like Silent Hunter, allowing players to experience virtual versions of the missions undertaken by the historical U-96. These cultural artifacts demonstrate how thoroughly the submarine and its cinematic representation have penetrated popular consciousness. Historical reevaluation of the U-boat campaign continues to evolve, with scholars debating its strategic significance and moral dimensions. From a purely military perspective, the campaign failed to achieve its objective of starving Britain into surrender. Despite sinking over 14 million tons of Allied shipping, the U-boats could not overcome the combined industrial might of Britain and America, which replaced vessels faster than they could be sunk. By May 1943, improved anti-submarine warfare had rendered the Type 7AC obsolete as an effective weapon. Yet the campaign came dangerously close to success in early 1943, when submarine sinkings outpaced new construction and Britain's food reserves dwindled to critical levels. Winston Churchill later wrote that the U-boat threat was the only aspect of the war that truly frightened him. The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. The moral evaluation of U-boat warfare remains complex and contested. Unlike the Holocaust or other clear Nazi atrocities, submarine warfare was practiced by all major naval powers and governed by evolving rules of engagement. Early in the conflict, U-boats generally adhered to prize rules, surfacing to allow merchant crews to abandon ship before sinking vessels. As the war intensified, both sides adopted increasingly unrestricted tactics. British Q ships, armed vessels disguised as merchantmen, made surface attacks more dangerous for U-boats, while German commanders received orders to attack without warning. By 1942, the Atlantic had become a no-quarter battlefield where survival often took precedence over humanitarian considerations. The crew of U-96, like submariners on all sides, operated within this moral gray zone, balancing military necessity against ethical constraints under conditions of extreme stress. The legacy of U-96 continues to evolve even in the 21st century. In 2018, nearly 4 decades after the film's release, Bavaria Fiction produced Das Boot as a television series, continuing the story beyond the events of the original film. Although this series focuses primarily on new characters, the shadow of the original U-96 and its commander looms large over the narrative. Meanwhile, marine archaeologists and historians continue to document the wrecks of U-boats scattered across the Atlantic seabed. These underwater archaeological sites, protected by international law as war graves, provide new insights into the technical aspects of submarine warfare and sometimes clarify historical uncertainties about particular engagements. The historical memory of U-96 exists in a curious duality. For naval historians, the submarine remains one vessel among hundreds that participated in the Battle of the Atlantic, significant for its operational success, but not fundamentally different from many other Type 7As. In German naval remembrance, U-96 occupies a modest place, overshadowed by more dramatic stories like that of U-47, which penetrated Scapa Flow, or U-505, captured intact by American forces. Yet in popular culture, thanks to Buchheim's novel and Peterson's film, U-96 has become the archetypal U-boat, the vessel through which millions of people understand the submarine war. This transformation of a specific historical artifact into a cultural symbol raises interesting questions about the relationship between history and memory, between events as they occurred and how they are subsequently represented and understood. The story of U-96 represents a unique intersection of military history and cultural memory. The actual submarine, though successful by the standards of the U-boat campaign, was just one of hundreds that served in the Kriegsmarine. Its operational history, while noteworthy, was not exceptional enough to distinguish it from many other boats that prowled the Atlantic. What made U-96 immortal was the presence of Buchheim during that fateful patrol in 1941, a witness who would later transform his experiences into art that transcended the specifics of the vessel itself. Through Buchheim's novel and Peterson's film, U-96 became something more than a historical artifact. It became a symbol of the human experience of war at sea. Today, as we reflect on the story of U-96, we are reminded that history lives not only in archives and museums, but in the stories we tell about the past. The actual U-96 may rest on the floor of the North Sea, gradually being reclaimed by the marine environment, but its ghost, manifested through literature, film, and the memories of those who served aboard similar vessels, refuses to fade away. In this sense, U-96 has indeed returned from the deep, not as steel and rivets, but but as a powerful reminder of both the technological terrors of modern warfare and the enduring resilience of those who face them. The submarine's legacy invites us to consider not just the strategic dimensions of naval warfare, but its human cost, the fear, courage, camaraderie, and moral complexity experienced by combatants on all sides of the conflict. The final patrol of U-96, unlike its cinematic portrayal, did not end in a dramatic air raid on a French harbor. Instead, the boat completed its ninth and final war patrol in March 1943 without major incident, returning to port as the tide of the U-boat war turned decisively against Germany. This anticlimax, so contrary to Hollywood conventions, perhaps best captures the reality of historical events, which rarely conform to narrative expectations. In the grand sweep of World War II, U-96 was both exceptional and ordinary, a weapon of war that performed its designated function efficiently before becoming obsolete. Its transformation into a cultural icon came not from any single heroic action, but from its role as a lens through which later generations could glimpse the underwater war that shaped the outcome of a global conflict. As time passes and the generation that experienced World War II firsthand gradually disappears, vessels like U-96 and the stories attached to them become increasingly important as bridges between past and present. The submarine exists now primarily as an idea, part historical fact, part artistic creation, that continues to evolve as each new generation encounters it. In this ongoing process of remembrance and reinterpretation, the ghost of U-96 refuses to die, emerging from the depths of history to remind us of a time when men in steel coffins fought beneath the waves in one of humanity's greatest conflicts. Their story, embodied in this single submarine, speaks to universal themes of courage, sacrifice, and survival that transcend national boundaries and the passage of time.